Let's start the seminar right now. Please help me to welcome Dr. James Wrightson as our speaker today. Dr. Wrightson is a visiting professor from the University of Brighton. He completed his PhD degree in exercise science at the University of Brighton, UK, last year. His PhD thesis investigated the role of the prefrontal cortex in the control of healthy adults' dual task gait. Using non-invasive brain stimulation techniques and behavioral manipulations, James investigated how and why the prefrontal cortex is involved in the ability of individuals to divide attentions between walking and a secondary task, for example, walking and talking at the same time. He started as a lecturer in the University of Brighton in 2015 and teaches in the area of biomechanics, motor neuroscience, and research methods. So his general research interest lies in the area of neural and cognitive control of locomotion, fatigue in disease and exercise, as well as non-invasive brain stimulation. In this seminar today, he will talk about his PhD work with the title, The Cognitive Control of Gait and Examination of the Dual Process Account. Please, James.
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm going to talk through some of the work I did in my PhD, which I did at the University of Brighton in the UK. And I'm going to rattle through a few of the studies that I did. Hopefully there'll be enough time. I'll try and keep it on time. If I haven't covered something, feel free to ask or quiz me at the end about it. Before we start, I think it's always important to give some definitions so everybody knows what it is you're talking about. I looked at the cognitive control of gait. For the purposes of this presentation and my work, I'm going to define cognitive control as this. Top-down mental processes that you need when you have to concentrate on a task. And when going on automatic or relying on instinct or intuition would be ill-advised, insufficient, or impossible. That's actually a description of what are known as executive functions or executive control from Diamond in 2014, but I think it's very suitable to understand what cognitive control is. Cognitive control, for the sake of this talk, is what happens when you can't go on automatic, when you have to pay attention, for want of a better phrase, to what it is that you're doing. In psychology, for a long time, in cognitive psychology, there's been a theory, a well-known theory, that there are tasks which could be considered automatic and tasks which could be considered controlled, require cognitive control. Tasks that can require cognitive control could be considered controlled tasks, tend to be more complex tasks, tasks that are new or novel that you haven't done before, tasks that require effort. Often it's described as tasks that are consciously controlled. I don't like the delineation between conscious and unconscious, that sort of Freudian work, so I tend to ignore conscious and unconscious. But if it helps you get an idea about what I'm talking about, these are tasks or processes that require conscious control. Automatic tasks, on the other hand, are really simple tasks or tasks that are well learned. They don't require much effort, or they're described as effortless often, and often they're described as unconscious tasks that you don't really need to pay attention to. Obviously, if you think about a day-to-day behavioral task that you do, there's probably no one task that could be considered purely automatic, and no one task that would be considered purely controlled. And it's probably a continuum between the two. It's a bit of an abstract idea. Often when people try and give an example of what a controlled task or a task that requires cognitive control would be, they would use the Stroop paradigm. So that is a testing paradigm where words are displayed, and the color of the words is different often to what the letters the word spells out. So in this case, the first word there, the participant would be required to say red, even though the word spells blue. Does that make sense? And it requires cognitive control. If you're not used to the Stroop task, or that seems a bit abstract, an example that is a bit more real world, particularly for me at the moment, is crossing the road in Canada. So I'm English, and in England we drive on the correct side of the road. The rest of the world drives on the wrong side of the road. So when I came to live in Canada, when I would go to cross the road, or particularly the sort of C-train crossings, I would always look to the right, because that's where cars should come from if everything worked properly here. However, as I found out, particularly when crossing C-train lines, C-trains often come from the left. And I've had a few near misses. Now, automatically, when I'm in the UK, I walk to the side of the road and I would look to the right. And I wouldn't really think about doing that. That might be considered a task that was more automatic. When I'm in Canada, doing that requires more control, more cognitive control. I have to walk to the side of the road and think, I'm in Canada, I might be killed, look to the left. So that's an example of a task that requires cognitive control. Okay. The way we examine tasks, typically the way we examine whether a task is more controlled or more automatic, is using a dual task paradigm. I keep getting blinded by the projector, sorry. And I'm going to quickly talk through that as well. A dual task paradigm, unsurprisingly, requires you to perform two tasks simultaneously. Imagine, and in Gait, frequently we would use walking and another task that we know requires cognitive control. For example, counting backwards. Counting backwards in sevens from a number, say maybe 300 or 500. Now, when you're walking, typically, and particularly in the older Gait literature, Gait is described as an automatic task. So that is, when you're walking, it doesn't require cognitive control. Counting backwards in sevens, however, would definitely be considered a task that would require cognitive control. It's difficult, it requires effort, it's complex, it's novel. In the dual task paradigm for walking, what we do is we perform both tasks at once. So we get you to walk and we get you to count backwards in sevens, for example. If there was a change in performance in either your counting performance or your walking performance, we would say that both tasks are trying to access the same cognitive processes. If, when you perform both tasks, there was no change in either task performance, then you would say that walking didn't require cognitive control because both tasks can be performed simultaneously. This body of research goes all the way back to William James in the 19th century, but looked at lots and lots in other domains, in Gait more recently since about the 1990s. There's now a reasonable body of research that says in healthy people, but particularly in older adults, healthy young people, or particularly in older adults and neurological patient groups, populations, that performing a secondary cognitive task alters Gait performance. This is a systematic review from 2011, and it's a good review, I recommend that you read it, but it's shown that a range of Gait variables can be changed if you get somebody to walk and count backwards. What is of particular interest for many people is the effect of this dual task Gait on variability, particularly variability of temporal kinematic Gait parameters such as stride time, swing time variability. The reason that that's of interest to people is because increased variability during dual tasking, so a dual task paradigm has been suggested to be linked or has been proposed to predict full risk in older adults in a range of studies and reviews. It will take me the rest of the talk to go into why that is or why it isn't. Really simply, it's assumed there's an inverse relationship between Gait variability and automaticity. The less variable the Gait, the more automatic is it assumed to be. The more the Gait requires control, the greater the increase in variability. Some other models have been proposed that try and explain this complicated relationship between cognitive functions, stride time variability, or variability, falls, dementia. I'm not going to talk about that too much. But that idea that variability somehow represents the automaticity of the movement is important for the work I'm going to talk about. Final bit of explanation, so I will actually get to my own work in a second. Final bit of explanation is with the dual process account. So the dual process account tries to refine that idea that variability is linked to automaticity. So often it's based on very few studies. This is a reasonably well-known study by Loveton. And it looked at the difference between the way old adults walk, or their variability, particularly stride time variability, and young adults on a treadmill. The first thing that they said was that old adults' variability is higher than young adults' variability. So it might be assumed that old adults' gait requires more control than young adults. Why that is speculative, but it might be due to age-related reductions in muscle tone or proprioceptive sensory motor apparatus, all of these things that may mean basically that older adults, or adults more inclined to fall, have to pay more attention to their walking. That's the assumption from that first bit. The second thing is that if you get older adults and younger adults, so older adults are on the top of this graph, younger adults are on the bottom of the graph, and this is their stride time variability on the y-axis. If you get them to perform a very easy cognitive task, this is a one-back task, which is very easy to perform for most cognitively intact people, stride time variability goes down in both groups. If the task is more difficult, in older adults, stride time variability goes up. Interestingly, in this paper, stride time variability didn't go up above what it would do at baseline, but other people have found it goes much higher. That doesn't happen in young adults. So in young adults, it doesn't matter how hard the second task is, when they're walking on a treadmill, their variability is reduced. And the assumption is that younger adults have increased cognitive reserve when they're walking. So when you load them with this extra task, their gait isn't impaired because they're not paying attention to their gait like older adults are, or because they have more cognitive reserve because they're younger, cognitive processing and cognitive function is suggested to decline as a function of age. While as in older adults, the addition of a second task, if it's difficult enough, will increase stride time variability. And stride time variability, as I said before, is linked to fall risk. So that is perhaps one of the reasons that older adults and people who are at risk of falling fall, is because when they walk, if they're trying to divide their attention when they're walking, if you think about when you're walking along the street, you often are dividing attention when you're walking. That's the thing about the dual task paradigm. When I started talking about this to students, I used to say when you're walking along, typing on your phone or talking on your phone, you always slow down. I always slow down, like to a halt sort of thing. Young people these days don't really slow down because they've been dual task practicing with their phone, talking all of their lives. So another thing might be, if you want a good example, if you're walking along talking to somebody on the phone and they say something that's really complicated, you've really got to think about, you might notice that you start to slow down, your gait might become more variable. In younger adults, perhaps, the suggestion is that doesn't happen. And that might be the difference between why old adults fall and why young adults don't. It's the relative difficulty of the task that's important. The dual process account has been used to explain differences between old and young adults' gait, neurological populations and healthy people's gait, and my interest in my PhD was used to examine differences in neural activation during dual task walking. My PhD actually used non-invasive, well, the aim of my PhD was to use non-invasive brain stimulation to look at the difference between older and younger adults using this dual process account. I'm not going to present that data today because I could spend the entire hour talking about non-invasive brain stimulation, the whys and wherefores, the problems with it. I'm going to talk about this, but I'm quite happy to talk about it at the end if anybody's got any questions. So before I got to the non-invasive brain stimulation part, I just wanted to do a couple of things with the dual process account. The first thing I wanted to do is check that it can replicate. It happened that most of the data the original work came from one lab. I wanted to check that I could get the same thing. Could I reduce stride time variability in healthy adults if I just gave them a cognitive task? And even if I made the task difficult, would it still keep the variability reduced compared to baseline, compared to a single task? The other question I had is how ecologically relevant is increasing the cognitive difficulty of a task? It's really easy to do in the lab. You get one task, and then you change some parameters of that task or change some function of that task and make it more difficult. Is that truly reflective of what happens outside? Might it be just that walking is more difficult, really? If you're walking in the grounds uneven, or there's people coming towards you, or there's pedestrians, is it something to do with the walking task that induces this change in stride time variability? So I wanted to know is, if I made the walking task really difficult for young adults, does stride time variability decrease again? Does the gait become more automatic when I ask them to do a second task, even if walking is really difficult? If the walking task was difficult enough, the dual process account would say that actually, when I get them to perform a second task, their stride time variability would increase. The gait would become less automatic. So, for the replication task, I just manipulated cognitive load. I got them to perform 2 cognitive tasks and just a single task walking. So walking with no task, walking while performing a Stroop task, and walking while performing a more complicated Stroop task, which is referred to as a switching Stroop or reverse Stroop sometimes. I'm not going into too much about what the reverse Stroop is, but it's more difficult. We asked people to rate which task was more difficult, and they said the switching Stroop task was more difficult. It required more effort. It was harder to do. So we got people to walk just in a single task condition, and we got them to walk and perform 2 tasks. Regardless of how difficult the task was, stride time variability was reduced in both tasks. So I basically have just replicated what had happened before, which is good practice if you're a budding scientist and you want to get into something. I wish I had done that a bit more with non-invasive brain stimulation, if the truth be told. But with Gait, so I found this effect and I'd replicated it. You can see these are not huge effects, to be honest with you. They're statistically significant. Talk maybe about meaningfulness later on. The other question is, what happens if walking is more difficult? I decided to make walking more difficult by manipulating walking speed, and for a whole range of reasons, both good and probably not so well thought out. This is quite early on in my PhD. Happy to talk about that, why at the end I would have done that. And I moved tasks from a Stroop task to what's called the serial sevens task. That is counting backwards in sevens from a number. This is a really difficult task to perform. It requires lots of effort and concentration. It requires you to hold information in your working memory and manipulate that information as you walk. And it's also widely used in clinical settings to examine cognition. This is the graph. I also looked at a secondary task, the M-back task. I'm not going to talk about that. That was for reasons to do with brain stimulation. Same thing happened in both tasks, which you can see from this graph. But for the sake of this presentation and clarity, I'm just going to present the serial 7 data. This is the graph we published. This paper got published last year, but I submitted it years and years ago. I now hate this graph. So for the sake of this presentation, I've created 2 graphs where it's a bit easier to see what's going on. Mostly on the previous graph, you couldn't see what was going on at the preferred walking speed. So even in the slow walking speed, which is, even in the slow walking speed, when I got participants to perform a second task, stride time variability decreased. That is, even when slow walking, and it was, even though it was considered to be more difficult, this is still not very difficult actually, and the Borg CR10 scale, sort of moderate to quite hard. Even though the walking was more difficult, when I asked them to perform a secondary task, stride time variability decreased. That is, in younger adults, all I'd done is replicated an existing effect that was, in younger adults, when you get them to perform a secondary task, stride time variability decreases, their gait becomes more automatic. So that was good, and that was going to be the basis for which I could go on and then look at age-related differences using brain stimulation. Okay, that's just something that happened. While I was writing the paper up, one of the things I struggled a little bit with is that some people there was some evidence that although there were lots of accounts of stride time variability going down during dual task walking, there were some accounts, even in healthy young adults, that stride time variability went up when you got them to perform a second task. And that would mean that gait became less automatic and they were perhaps behaving more like older adults would do. And I couldn't really understand why. I mean, it might just be noise, or couldn't really understand why there'd be that difference. One of the things that I did notice, though, is that in all the studies where stride time variability went up, young adults were walking over ground. And on all the studies where stride time variability went down, young adults were walking on a treadmill. And I wondered, well, what if this dual process account just refers to treadmill walking? There are well described, although whether they are meaningful or not, the biomechanists in here will probably be able to tell me a bit more about, but there are well described differences between overground and treadmill walking for kinetics and kinematics and so forth. What is less well described is whether there's differences in cognitive control between those two walking modalities. So I wondered, what if the dual process account just describes walking on a treadmill? What if that actually doesn't happen when you get healthy young adults to do walking over ground as they would do typically outside of the lab? So I ran a fairly simple experiment whereby I got young adults, about 20 of them, to walk over ground and on a treadmill, and to count backwards and sevens on both walking. So it's just to walk normally and then to walk and count backwards and sevens. I didn't control for walking speed between the two modalities because I didn't want the people who were doing, I didn't want them when they were doing the overground walking to pay attention to how fast they were walking. That wasn't the task that I was asking them to do. And then again, they performed 0-7 tasks. Pleasingly, walking speed was walking velocity. We used accelerometers for this experiment, and in fact, all of the experiment that I'm going to present today. Walking stride velocity was roughly the same across both walking modalities, which was actually a bit surprising. I didn't think that would be the case, but it was. It hasn't been in subsequent experiments. The other thing, the most important finding, I guess, is that stride time, the effect of a secondary task on stride time variability was not the same on the treadmill and the overground walking. On these graphs, I'm not sure if this is a point. Oh. Okay. So on the y-axis here is the dual task cost on stride time variability. Really, that should read the dual task change on stride time variability. It's the change from the single task performance, i.e. when you're performing no secondary tasks, to the dual task performance. I called it dual task change initially when I submitted the paper, but reviewer 2 was absolutely adamant, and so dual task cost it is from here and onwards. So what you're looking at here is whether there is a dual task change from single to dual task in overground and treadmill walking. And you can see here that in overground walking, that's this white box here, this is the mean and 95% confidence interval. There is a dual task cost on overground walking. On treadmill walking, there's this reduction in stride time variability that I'd seen before, but actually, this 95% confidence interval contains 0. So maybe that is not really that meaningful a change anyway. Right? It might statistically be different from single to dual task. The P might be less than 0.05 if you look at that. But it may not be meaningful. It may not mean anything. It may be quite a variable measure. There's no change in cognitive task performance between single and dual tasks. That's a fairly frequently described effect in younger adults because of this assumed cognitive reserve. The other thing is that there was no I'm not sure if you can see that, no difference in the perceived task difficulty. Sorry about this graph, I didn't actually graph this information in the paper. This is from the stats program, which is why it looks a bit poor. But basically difficulty was the same, perceived difficulty certainly was the same between overground and treadmill walking. Now the dual process account would say that the reason stride time variability has increased here is because people find overground walking more difficult, overground dual task walking more difficult than treadmill dual task walking. But they certainly didn't perceive that they did, and there wasn't really any difference in cognitive task performance. It's just a difference in what happens with their gait. And so the final question I've asked, or the final question in this study, is maybe it's just that when you're walking on a treadmill and you're asked to perform a second task, you focus on the second task. But when you're walking overground and you're asked to focus on a second task, maybe you focus a bit more on your walking. That's really, it's like a common sense question, I think, but not one that's particularly been looked at in the literature. So I did that. I ran the same experiment. I got people to walk overground and walk on a treadmill and perform counting backwards and sevens. But I got them to do it 3 times in each walking modality, and I asked them to concentrate on a different part of the task. I asked them to either concentrate on neither task, so don't focus on either one, just perform the task. Focus on your walking performance, your gait performance, focus on the cognitive task performance. Try and perform as well as you can in the cognitive task, try and walk as smoothly as possible. Those are the instructions. The first thing is that I replicated the effect that I saw in the previous experiment. There is an effect, a dual task effect on overground walking, but not on treadmill walking, probably. You get this increase here, you get this decrease, which I'd seen before, but again, the confidence interval goes through 0. The second thing is that if you ask people to concentrate on their walking, in both walking modalities, this was a statistically significant difference between on their cognitive task performance between the focus. So if you're walking on the treadmill and I ask you to focus on your gait, your cognitive task performance is statistically worse than it is if I asked you to focus on the cognitive task. Same happens with overground walking. Again, this is median plus the confidence interval data. This goes through 0 again. I'm having a little trouble interpreting this data, I must be honest. This is fairly new data. The other thing that I found with this, so the dual process account says that what happens when people perform a secondary task is they stop focusing on the gait. And on the treadmill, young adults, they stop focusing on the gait, it becomes more automatic. But I asked people to focus on the cognitive task away from the gait here, and it made no difference to their stride time variability. It made no difference to the automaticity of their gait at all. So, unfortunately, these are recent results that I've only just started writing up from work I did during my PhD, but didn't go in my PhD. But unfortunately, they suggest that this paradigm that I've been looking at for a few years might not be quite as robust as I hoped and other people have made out. Maybe this change in variability doesn't represent automaticity at all. I need to do more work on this. This is a fairly small study, maybe 24 people, I think. This needs to be replicated in a much larger sample. Okay, so that was like a whistle-stop tour of some of the work I've done in cognitive control of gait. The take-home messages, I guess, is that during overground walking, if you get people to perform a secondary task, there's a change in variability. And that change in variability is of interest to lots of people because it's linked to fall risk. We can say that overground walking definitely requires cognitive control. The picture for treadmill walking is much less clear. It's not clear whether those changes in treadmill walking are meaningful, and what they certainly do not do is represent what happens in overground walking. The dual process account, which is used to describe lots and lots of effects now in the differences between certain populations, doesn't explain or doesn't really very well explain what happens during overground walking. The walking modality is really important. The task is really important, basically. If your inference is to be in any way ecologically valid, the task here is essential, and that perhaps a lot of the work in this whole theory is based on a task that doesn't necessarily represent what's happening in the world. Treadmill walking is not the same as overground walking, and that is a well-known fact in many fields, but in this particular cognitive science field, it's less well appreciated, I think. Lots of work being done on the neural correlates of gait and what happens, why the difference between Parkinson's patients and healthy patients in their dual task performance and their brain function, in older adults and younger adults in their brain function, in those who fall and those who do not. But if you're doing it on a treadmill, that might not necessarily represent what happens if you're doing it overground. So these neural correlates, and people are looking at these structures as possible targets for things like non-invasive brain stimulation, invasive brain stimulation perhaps. If those neural targets that you're getting from the treadmill, if the task is not representative of actually the task that you're interested in, then that data might not be as much use as you thought. And this is the work that I want to continue, really. I want to look at this, but in an overground situation, I want to use non-invasive brain stimulation to look at these neural correlates. Okay. So, that's it from me. Just acknowledgements from our team in the UK, Nick, Rosie, Emma, and thank you, he's not here, but to Dr. Millet for inviting me to be a visiting professor. Thank you very much.
wondering, is variability a bad thing?
Yeah, so will you review it too? That's a really good question. I've purposely moved away from, sometimes in the literature, particularly when you're looking at clinical populations or older or those who fall, an increase in variability is considered bad. But some amount of variability is a requirement of a healthy motor system. And in fact, really, really super low variability is probably as counterproductive to a good, well-controlled motor system as too much variability. So no, it's not. I would not say that variability is a bad thing or a good thing. It's context dependent, I guess. Too much variability, like too little variability, is probably a bad thing, and that's what people worry about. But in healthy young adults, I steer clear away from that because they very rarely fall when they walk, unless they're drunk or not paying attention to what they're doing on their phone.
Do you think figuring out a way to look at maybe stability in multitasking would be better?
Yeah. So the stride time variability, it's funny because stride time variability is assumed to represent a rhythmic action of gait, and that's sort of morphed in the literature to consider to represent gait stability, but it's not necessarily stability. I've looked at trunk range of motion as a marker of stability, and on the treadmill you don't see as many effects. Also, there was a lot of work being done in brain stimulation and just variability, and people weren't looking at trunk ROM so much. So I haven't looked at it too much. It possibly is an idea. I think there would need to be a series of studies where they said this marker of stability is linked to fall risk, and that's different in old and young adults, perhaps, which I'm not sure if there is one.
Has there been any work done on doing this dual task on instrumented treadmills? Because I think that maybe you can get something like center of pressure trace while a person is walking, which might be something that's more related to fall risk. I'm just wondering, has anyone ever done it on, because that would give a better indice of variability that could relate to falls.
They've done it on instrumented treadmills, definitely, and on split belt instrumented treadmills. But honestly, because I was looking at what happened with the variability, I couldn't tell you what it was that was happening with the kinetics. I guess it's sometimes with these things, particularly neuroscience, it's the ease of the measurement. So if you like stride time variability, you can put an accelerometer or even really an iPhone, and you can get your patient to walk up and down in your clinic, and you don't need anything expensive. And that's why I think it is as popular as it is. And also it shows this nice effect with fall risk. There is data on that, but because it was not the focus of my PhD, I couldn't tell you what that data would say.
How did you control speed for the overground locomotion?
So we did it using instructions. So in the treadmill, we had a set protocol whereby we took speed up and took speed down for above and beyond what they identified as preferred walking speed until they would say, this is my preferred walking speed. We'd get them to do that on the treadmill first of all. For overground walking, I asked them to try and walk at the same speed, and for both tasks, I asked them to anchor that walking speed to a real life situation, so what it felt like. So for example, walking, I first of all started using walking to university, but obviously with students they don't want to walk to university. So in the end I would use walking to shops or walking to training or walking to the gym or what have you. What I didn't want to do is get them to focus on how fast they were walking, because I was interested in this relationship between what happens with gait and what happens with, initially what happens with gait and then what happens when you have the dual task. If you're getting them to focus on the walking condition, you might confound that what normally happens with the dual task.
They're then free to be variable in speed, certainly as much as the step time.
Yeah, definitely.
And the treadmill would give another input that you don't get in overground.
Yeah, so I haven't collected data on that, but in my Viva, one of the things that we talked about was maybe in what's happening in the treadmill is that The treadmill just does the walking for you. It's motorized pretty much, single bolt treadmill. It's doing the walking for you, and it's controlling all of these things that when you pay attention to something else, it's controlling stride time and speed, and you don't control any of that. In fact, the task constraints are probably very different. If you think about what it is you're trying to do when you're walking over the ground, you're trying to get from one point to another. But on a treadmill, you're not trying to move at all. You're trying to stay in one place. And so it maybe is that difference. But I haven't collected. It's definitely something I'm interested in looking at, but I haven't collected data looking at. But definitely, yeah, that the reason might not be just that they prioritize different tasks. It might be that the task is so different, what you're asked to do is so different, that the measures just represent different things across those two modalities.
I'm not sure whether I understood correctly, but your goal is to reduce the risk of falling?
Originally, my goal was to reduce the risk of falling, yes. I never actually got to that point because I spent a lot of time looking at this, and I spent a lot of time looking at non-invasive brain stimulation and trying to get that to work.
And then you're arguing that if you add another task, the variability is increasing and therefore the risk of falling is higher?
That's the argument in the literature, yeah.
But then you show the graph where actually the variability decreased by counting backwards. So why don't you just tell older adults to count backwards while they're walking, and that would solve the problem?
I guess it's because it depends how relatively difficult it is. If you were good at counting backwards, or you weren't cognitively impaired, then that would be fine. But it's the relative cognitive load that's important. So in a patient group, or mild cognitively impaired people or demented people, actually even just counting backwards a little bit might not reduce variability. If the task is really easy, then it does reduce variability on a treadmill. If the task is slightly more difficult to you, so in older adults that's increasing the load, then variability is increased. On a treadmill, actually overground, that might not be true at all.
If I'm not mistaken, you mentioned that when you wanted your participants to count backward, there were 3 different or 4 different levels of difficulty?
Yeah, so originally, not in the counting backwards task. You could do that, but I didn't. I just used...
What was the task when you asked them for different level of difficulty?
So the original paper from 2008, that used an n-back working memory task. So you can quite easily quantitatively change that load. So for those of you not familiar with an n-back task, you present a list of letters or numbers and you ask the people to remember a certain number back. So a 1-back task, you would just have to repeat the letter that appeared 1 back, so the last letter. And something like a 4-back task is the letter that appeared 4 back. That's really, really difficult to perform. The way I manipulated cognitive load was with a Stroop, and then a Stroop with like a reverse Stroop. So Stroop, reverse Stroop, if you're familiar with that, or switching Stroop. So that whether they respond to the word or the color depends on the cues that are on the screen.
But when you measure the cognitive perceived effort, or whatever you call it, there was no difference between these 3 different levels.
There were, so yeah, I'll bring up that. Yeah.
Yeah, here.
Yeah. So, and also actually, so I've got it here. So you're right that people find, but on this slide, people found switching Stroop more difficult when they were walking than they found the Stroop task. So it's a more difficult task. But actually, they didn't, in neither one, they found it more difficult than baseline. So that they actually found it more difficult to stand there and do those tasks, or sit there and do those tasks, than they did when they were walking. I don't have a good explanation for that, unless it's just something as simple as the inverted U. So Yeats-Dodson, that there's some level of arousal that is changed by walking a little bit.
So actually, my main question is that did you consider the number of errors in their task?
Yeah.
So if it's not really, if it's not something that they would be punished, I mean number of errors, if they are not going to be punished, so why they should care to count things backward or do these tasks correctly? That's why if they do not care, it's not going to affect their performance. But if they really, really pay attention to it, then they are going to probably have their first task.
Yeah, I mean, getting young people to care about, young undergraduates to care about performing cognitive psychology tasks is a problem for the field on the whole, I think. If it was only me that had seen this and it was only in this population, then perhaps you might have an argument that, yeah, my sample just didn't care and they didn't perform. But it's been seen many other places, and people have looked at things like motivation, task motivation, whether that changes. There's some evidence if you mentally fatigue people, for example, you start to really impair these effects, which would suggest some sort of motivational drive has been impaired there. It is something I've thought about, and that mental fatigue paradigm is a really useful one, I think, for getting to that, but not something I've done.
Thanks for the talk. I was thinking, since you see a difference in treadmill walking and overground walking, have you considered looking into the working memory model of Badley, where you have the different inputs, like sensory input, walking input, that actually influences the stride variability? Because I can imagine if you have so much sensory information, and whether it's bottleneck or parallel or serial, whatever, how you would describe it, that definitely influences the task in whole.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Like visual, is it different if I tax a visual spatial sketchpad versus a phonological loop? So we've played around with stimuli type, so visually presented and external stimuli, for example. We've played around with response, articulation versus clicking. We've played around with internal task versus external task, like counting backwards in sevens is something that doesn't have necessarily an external cue and might be considered to just tax a central executive rather maybe than the phonological loop or the visuals. And we found no difference, that on a treadmill the same thing happens. Overground, there's an argument that different executive functions play a different part. But when I'm talking about executive functions, I'm not really talking about Badley's model, but more that sort of Miyake idea of 3 core executive functions. Do you know those, like inhibition, switching? There's an argument that those have a different part to play in Gait. I'm not sure I'm particularly convinced by it. I think it's more to do with just there is a task, load, really. How difficult is the task? How much effort? More like that sort of Kahneman model, the effortful. Oh, okay, so yeah, so more like it's how much cognitive effort that's required to drive the task, rather than necessarily than the modality or the response type or so forth.
I'd like to go back a little bit to the last point, kind of similar. So do you have any control over how accurately they were doing this cognitive test? Because sometimes you even mentioned how much they cared about the cognitive test, but maybe if you have a measure of how accurate they were in doing that task, maybe that might give you some different.
You mean their performance?
Yeah, exactly.
No, so in this slide, I haven't put the data up for every experiment because I would just bombard you with graphs. But where are we? If I go to these, this is the cognitive task data here. And so this effect that you see where there's not really a true effect, in young healthy adults, that is widely shown that there's a ceiling effect basically, and I've not seen in the literature a task that was so difficult that is validated that causes that to change. Okay.
Can you tell me the plan that you're going to do for your brain stimulation exposure?
Yeah, so I'd hope to get away without talking about brain stimulation. The first thing I'm going to do is to get brain stimulation to work. The second thing would be so I'm interested in, that often when people look at neural correlates of an action, they will look at imaging. So you might use EEG or NIRS or a functional NIRS. Always got to be one of those two, I guess. Most of my expertise, if you want to call it that, is in using non-invasive brain stimulation as like a virtual lesion, whereby you alter activity in a given brain area or given brain network that's linked to this performance, and then see if performance changes. We published in that a couple of times, but with the current technique with non-invasive brain stimulation, as it was when I did my PhD, it's not really there yet.
So talk about creating virtual lesion.
Yeah.
Was it painful for the subjects?
No, it is. I mean, it's called a virtual lesion, which makes it sound a lot grander than it is. You're changing with non-invasive brain stimulation. You're changing the polarity of the neuronal cell membrane by very small amounts. The idea is that it brings it closer to threshold for action potential propagation and so forth. Most people will not know whether they've had a placebo or a non-invasive brain stimulation. It's different to perhaps the TMS that you would see in Dr. Mier's lab, where you have this huge action potential response. It's much less invasive than that, but also much less effective.
Go first. Okay. Early on, you mentioned that you had a little difficulty with the conscious versus subconscious action of locomotion. And I would submit that there's many aspects of walking that are both. So when I think I want to walk across the room, I can imagine the steps I'm going to take, but I don't imagine the impulses that I'm going to apply and the timings and all of those relationships, which are the complexity of the mechanisms of the locomotion. So some of it is unconscious.
Yeah.
So with something like, for instance, the split belt treadmill with asymmetric belts,
Yeah.
an individual immediately accommodates and is consciously aware of that. So you stay on the belt, you don't fall off, and you walk in an odd way because the two belts are going different speed. But after about 5 to 10 minutes, everybody adapts to it, and they're not doing it consciously. And they change the way they move, but they're not aware of doing something to make it themselves work on that belt.
Yeah.
How does that fit with your paradigm of conscious control?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I don't like conscious, unconscious, and one of the reasons I don't use attention is because you can, there's a concept that you can be there's cognitive control that doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily need to be aware of it. Does that make sense? So in a Stroop task, you're not consciously aware each time the word comes up, oh, I'm doing the Stroop task, I must respond to the color, not the word. That's not what happens in that task. And yet there is a delay when you do the one that's reversed, so you have to respond to the color compared to the word. You're not necessarily consciously aware of that cognitive processing. You're not thinking each time it's a Stroop task, but it's there, it happens. It results in a clear, quantifiable delay in the response. That's why I don't like conscious, unconscious. There can be some cognitive processing going on that isn't necessarily consciously aware. One of the things that would be interesting, I guess, and I don't know, is if you do that split belt treadmill and you've got one leg going one way and one going the other, and the people that have adapted after 5 minutes, what happens if you perform a secondary task then? Does that alter the gait? If it does, then is that an indication there might be some control? I honestly don't know the answer to that. But that would be the thing that I would probably want to ask about that. Just because they are not consciously aware doesn't mean there isn't some level that's required where they're still cognitively processing that task. Did that answer the question?
Just out of curiosity then, for the non-invasive stimulation, was the plan to do it online with something like TDCS, or was it offline, repetitive TMS?
So you can do it offline with TDCS as well.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so when I've done it offline using TDCS.
Okay.
And then mostly that was because when I started doing this PhD, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the brain stimulation literature, but early on, just 2010 onwards, there was a great deal of excitement and a lot of positive reports. Those have since sort of disappeared a bit. RTMS is probably the better evidence method, and if I was to go into it, the issues can sometimes be ethically with doing RTMS. With TDCS, there's not any reported side effects online or offline. With RTMS, obviously, there are some occurrences of seizures and what have you, particularly in the motor cortex, RTMS, not so much. So it would be with, maybe not TDCS, like first generation, but TACS maybe, or TRNS, something linked to maybe oscillations on the EEG. I've seen some really nice work with that. That would be the way that it would go.
And would it have been plan to do repetitive TMS over prefrontal cortex then, or what was the plan to do it over motor cortex first?
So it would probably be over prefrontal cortex. The TDCS work I did was over prefrontal cortex. It's really hard to quantify that effect, you know. With motor cortex, it's so easy. I changed excitability and the motor evoked response was changed downstream in the hand. With dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's much more difficult, but I still think that is going to be the target. I just don't think we have the technique maybe quite there yet to get to that target.
Your second task is a cognitive task. So I'm wondering, just as a negative control, have you tried to use an automatic task as a second task? Like people are walking, but at the same time they are watching TV or they are thinking. So would they have the same effect, or it's specific to a cognitive task?
Okay, so I haven't looked at that. I know people have done stuff with, particularly with carrying a cup, water, motor type, because those obviously for many population groups, carrying a cup to and from the kitchen or do that sort of dual tasking, there's less enough effect. And that goes right back to the heart of the dual task paradigm, I guess, that perhaps holding the cup and walking don't necessarily require fully the same processes, or just that the holding the cup task isn't difficult enough to induce a change in gait, for example. The evidence is more mixed for that. People find much bigger effects with a cognitive load, a cognitive task. And I think it really, and often they look at different populations. So in stroke, for example, doing a secondary motor task would be very much more difficult than in older adults. There's lots of stuff on bimanual tasks and the interference there, and you do get interference along with that whole dynamical system sort of synchronicity that they talk about.
You also thought about as a second verification of the cognitive load to do like the pupil diameter measurements or skin connectivity?
Yeah, I would have really loved to have done that. Ours was quite a poor university without any of that equipment, so the fact that it isn't there is just through not having it available, just to measure arousal if nothing else. We've done stuff with heart rate to look at, you know, in the classic sort of Yeats-Dobson idea of arousal, the inverted U, but skin conductance or pupils, I'd love to be able to go to a lab and do that work. I haven't done it
there. So you talk about dual task paradigm. What if there's another task element?
A triple task paradigm. Yeah.
Say you're walking, you're counting backwards, and then you are also told that within the durations of the test, you may receive mechanical perturbations. You don't know when. So does it mean that the stride time variability will increase or decrease over time?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen anyone who's looked at that. I would imagine if you tell people something is going to happen to their gait, they're likely to pay attention to their gait. And so the stride time variability would go up no matter what the third task would be.
It would be like interesting to see if they were told that, okay, you're going to receive 2 mechanical perturbations, like someone's going to push you.
Yeah.
Within that run walking.
Yeah.
They will see the first one.
Yeah.
Then you see the progressions of the variability. And then they will anticipate the second one because they were told that they will be the second one. But you don't give them the second one.
Okay.
And see that if the variability will decrease over time or stay high enough.
Yeah, I'll definitely give pushing people over while they're doing it a go. Yeah.
but my other question is, what does it mean? Like, if I see difference, if I don't see difference, like how can I use these information?
Yeah, whether it's meaningful or not. I'd hoped when I started my PhD to present what I would be doing in situations like this, would be presenting a raft of Nature published studies on how brain stimulation improved dual task gait. That didn't happen. And whether this is meaningful or not, my data doesn't answer, particularly I don't think, because I've just been looking at one particular part, which is that in young adults this happens and actually perhaps it doesn't really happen. what needs to happen now is that whether this dual processor count, which is used to describe gait in older adults, like the easy cognitive, whether that applies to overground walking, and whether that's related to full risk, needs to be the most logical next step for that, I think.
So have you looked at, or has anyone looked into like the rate at which the variability is changing? So you can have like a huge variability in your speed, but you're kind of oscillating slowly back and forth between those two states, between the two extremes. Has anyone looked at how quickly it changes?
No, the only work that I've known that's not just looked at magnitude has looked at the structure of the variability using sort of the trended fluctuation analysis and so on. So what happens over long time course correlations. I'm not sure if anybody has looked at whether there's a huge bump in variability. Is that what you're saying? There's a huge bump in variability?
Between two strides, like you go from taking one, your right leg comes forward fairly slowly, and your left leg that comes forward really quick. It's like if the variability changes, you have this big change in rate, but it happens over a long period of time versus a big change that happens within one step, like you slip and catch yourself.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean, yeah. No, nobody's looked at that, but I think that one of the things we are looking at is whether articulating something on a stride-by-stride basis changes that variability. So if you're asking somebody to walk along and count, on the strides where they're not counting, is that different than the strides when they are counting? We're looking at that currently. Okay. When I say we, a really clever PhD student, I don't really understand the maths for that, but somebody else is looking at that currently. Hopefully we'll be able to publish that data soon.
Any other questions? No, let's thanks.
Please come back next week for more exciting seminar. It's Dr. John Bertrand sitting here from the Department of Cell Biology and Anatomy. Will explain to us the converse effect of speed and gravity on walking and running from the perspective of energetics. I'll see you next week.